This is the Evergreen Empire.
Green grow the forests and fair flow the streams. The gentle deer grazes, the wild blossom gleams. From ocean wave raging to mountain serene, all nature's proclaiming our land's evergreen.
Welcome to Columbia Conversations. I'm Feliks Banel, editor of Columbia Magazine for the Washington State Historical Society. On this episode, we speak with Dr. Quintard Taylor, history professor emeritus from the University of Washington, author of The Forging of a Black Community about Seattle's Central District, and founder of BlackPast.org.
Whenever there's a change in demography, particularly of the size and significance of the gentrification that is taking place in the Central District, then there are things that you will lose. There's something that you're going to lose. The question is, can you reproduce it? Can you recreate it in some other form or fashion elsewhere?
I reached Dr. Taylor by phone from his home in Seattle. Dr. Quintard Taylor, thanks for joining us for Columbia Conversations.
Well, thank you for having me.
So you're retired now? Is that congratulations in order?
I'm retired. Yeah, that's what emeritus
Very nice.
means.
Well,
I taught there from 1999. I held the position as chair, Scott and Dorothy Willett chair, from 1999 to 2018.
Nice.
I just retired in June 30th, on June 30th of 2018.
Wow, very nice. Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
First of all, when did you first visit the Central area?
My first visit to the Central area or the Central District, there's still debate about whether or not we should call it the Central District or the Central area. I chose the district. I first came partly because I was teaching at Washington State University. The first academic job I ever had was an assistant professor at Washington State University. I was there from 1971 to 1975. And of course, if you're in Pullman, you want to seek every opportunity you can to get out of Pullman. and I did, and we did. And so we came to Seattle as often as we could. We came to other places as well. I think one of the interesting things about Pullman is that it's sort of being there encourages you to see the rest of the state. Whereas if you live in Seattle or Tacoma, you're less likely to travel across the state. So I got a very, very good sense, a high-level sense of the entire state of Washington early on. And so that has helped to shape my perspective about living in the Pacific Northwest and particularly in this state. So at any rate, to answer your question, I probably came to the Central District the first time in the summer of 72. I arrived in September of 71. I went right away to teaching at WSU, and then by the first summer, I was coming to Seattle. In fact, by the first summer, I was already involved in a history project that would sort of dominate my life forever. I don't know how much time you want in terms of this interview, but
this is great.
But I was teaching at WSU, and I was teaching a standard African American history course. And a student, a tall, lanky student, at that time I think he was on the basketball team, named Billy Ray Flowers, asked me, why is it when you people, and I didn't take offense at that, why? Because he was talking about historians in this context. Why is it when you people discuss African American history, you never talk about the West? And I said, I was 22 years old. I was far too young to be in a classroom teaching. I said, because there is no Black history in the West. And he responded, and, he was brave enough to challenge me. And he began to talk about his own family who had come out to Portland in the 1850s.
Wow.
And I was just so fascinated by that because I grew up in Tennessee and I'd gone to school in North Carolina and Minnesota. I had never heard stories about, African Americans in the West, and certainly not in Portland. And so I was so fascinated with this. Long story short, that I decided that I wanted to do some research on this, and we got a small grant. I think the grant was probably $5,000 from Washington State University, and that allowed us to get a car, to have enough money to pay for a state car, a tape recorder, some tapes, and for me to hire a research assistant to help me go throughout the region interviewing African Americans and people who knew African Americans about Black history in this region, in the Pacific Northwest. And of course, the obvious choice for the research assistant was Billy Ray Flowers. and so armed with a state car, Billy Ray Flowers, a tape recorder, and not much overall knowledge about the region. We began to sort of find African Americans who would be willing to talk to us about their story. This was a time when oral history was all the rage, and so we decided to do these oral history interviews. And I'll tell you, Felix, the first interviews were in places like Moscow, Idaho, north of Moscow, Idaho,
Huh.
or in Walla Walla, or in small towns near and around Pullman. Because what was, to my surprise, to my shock, was that there were these blacks who were descendants of homesteaders who had settled in the area about the time of statehood. They had settled in both northern Idaho and in far eastern Washington. There was one family, one black family, and I'm blanking on the name now, but it was the King family, and they owned King Valley, which was probably 5,000 or 6,000 acres of land in a small valley, no more than 30 miles north of Pullman.
Huh.
I mean, imagine that. Who in Pullman, black or white, would have known that there would be black landowners, that close to Pullman, Washington. And so that fascinated me. And so my point here is that I began to interview African Americans in places we think they shouldn't have been, like Pendleton and Walla Walla and Pomeroy and those kind of places. And it really dawned upon me that there's a lot of history that needs to be uncovered and needs to be told. And so that was really my introduction to this. And so I actually ended up coming to Seattle and Portland and Tacoma relatively late in the process of trying to construct or reconstruct this African American history in the Pacific Northwest, because we started in the small towns. We literally started in the small towns. We ended up going to Roslyn, I think, before we got to Seattle.
And are those tapes still in the collection over at WSU, or where'd those tapes end up?
It's interesting you would ask that. They are, theoretically, they are in the collection at WSU. They have been in the collection since the 1970s. One of the requirements was that all the taped interviews would stay at the Washington State University Library.
Yeah.
And they've gone through various iterations, but as far as I know, they are still at the library. The last time I checked was about 5 years ago when they were there.
Were they ever digitized or made more accessible than just on the tapes or whatever they were on originally?
That's a question I can't answer. You'd have to check with WSU on that. We're talking interviews that took place in the early 1970s.
Wow, that would be, okay. That's on my list of things to check out.
Yeah, and those interviews, in fact, led to our TV series, South by Northwest, which was, the result of a grant that we received from what was then called the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. Again, long story short, they funded us. They gave us $270,000, which is at that time an enormous amount of money, to do a 5-part TV series based upon my research on African Americans in the Pacific Northwest. And one of the stipulations was that we had to film on location, or as close to on location as possible, where the event happened.
Huh.
And this was the odd one. We had to not use film. We had to use videotape. And so we were some of the first people to use videotape. Now you can actually see those episodes, all of those episodes, if you go to BlackPast. Go to BlackPast, go to the multimedia page, and then just go to South by Northwest.
Oh, cool. I can't wait to check those out.
Yeah. Now, but understand, these were done in the 1970s, okay?
Oh, yeah, no, I understand. Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. I hope they were very different than TV today, because it was more of a craft back then in some ways.
Yeah, very much.
I guess what I'm trying to get at is sort of the difference between the central area you visited as a civilian or a non-academic or not, and the one that you discovered in your research over the next 20 years, I guess. What were the things about the Central District that you learned through your research that weren't visible on the surface when you were just visiting as a very young man, 50 years ago?
Well, to be honest, I don't know if I ever visited the Central District when I wasn't doing research.
Okay.
That would be the reason for me coming over.
Got it.
But I had certain preconceived notions based upon my experiences back east. I mean, most of us came from back east. Most of us in Washington State, even to this day, somehow or another ended up coming out from back east, or our parents came from back east. And so I was no exception. And I based a lot of my ideas about, quote, the ghetto on what was going on back east. I expected to see a densely populated area. I expected to see very few non-blacks in the area. I expected to see much more dilapidated housing. Now, there certainly was bad housing in the Central District, but certainly it paled in comparison, no pun intended, but paled in comparison to the South Side of Chicago or New York's Harlem or any of the other major black communities at that time. And so that was a shock. That was actually a shock. The other thing, I don't know if it was a shock, but the other thing was that, size matters. The Central District was a predominantly black community, but it was a relatively small community when compared, say, to Los Angeles or compared to Houston, Texas, or Chicago, Illinois. And so that sort of determined a lot of what would happen or wouldn't happen in that area. I think, on the other hand, the research in the Central District, even though there were certain things that clearly were not similar to other areas of the country, there was a lot that was the same. And that was not necessarily surprising, but it was in some ways disappointing.
What are those things that would be the same?
The same was the fact that there was high unemployment. There was particularly high youth unemployment. There was crime, significantly high crime. There were drugs. There was a drug scene in the Central District. It was essentially the conditions that you could find in any black community across America at the time. They could be replicated on a smaller scale, obviously, but they could be replicated in the Central District. And so, go ahead.
I was going to say, were there differences or similarities between how the Central District and the residents there related to the rest of the sort of more white city compared with similar communities in other parts of the country where there's a black community and black neighborhood surrounded by a
that's a good question. I guess the way I would answer that is that people in the Central District understood fully that even though this was a black community, they were in a sea of whites. In other words, the overwhelming majority of the people in Seattle, and certainly almost all of the power structure, was white at the time. Whereas in a place like, Atlanta or New York or Chicago or Houston or Los Angeles, there would be a large enough black community so that there would be a cadre of black political leaders. I think at that time in the Central District, and this happened in 1967, the first black person elected to the city council in the history of Seattle was Sam Smith. And that's relatively late, 1967. There were no other black office holders at the local level that I recall, and there were a couple of blacks that were in the state legislature, but that's it as far as political representation. And so that was unusual. Again, it was a difference in degree, because certainly there was no city in America that had proportionate black representation. So I don't want to suggest that somehow or another Chicago had the representation it should have, given the size of the population. But certainly when you look at the power structure of Seattle, it was exceedingly white. And so that was the milieu in which African Americans had to operate. Again, I'm trying to answer your question.
Yeah, no, this is great. This is exactly the kind of stuff I was hoping to hear. And in the time you were observing, like say from the early 70s up until the time your book's published, what were the most significant changes that happened in that neighborhood?
Gentrification. Gentrification was beginning, and actually it was beginning in the 1970s and certainly in the 1980s, but it was almost imperceptible. I can relate a conversation that I had, and I'll use some names here. Mrs. Constance Thomas. She's no longer with us now, but ironically, she was about my age now. She was about 71 or 72 when I talked to her. She was one of the people I interviewed, and I interviewed her because she was second generation Seattleite, but her parents had come around World War I, and her parents, her father was from Jamaica, and he was actually active in the Garvey movement in Seattle. Yes, there was a small Garvey movement in Seattle. Wow. And she and her sisters were some of the earliest black students, and this was in the 1930s and 1940s. You have to check the dates. But they were some of the earliest black students to attend the University of Washington. So they had that distinction. And one of the sisters eventually became one of the first black people appointed to the legislature. She didn't run for a full term, or she didn't win, but she was appointed to the legislature in 1966. So Mrs. Thomas was a fixture in the community. She was, she was a leader in the community. She was someone that everyone looked up to, everyone talked to. And she told me something. She relayed a story. I was in a car with her and another elderly black woman and another researcher. It could have been Billy Ray Flowers. It could have been someone else. And she said, "Mark my words. Understand that one day whites will recognize how valuable Central District property is, and they will start moving back here." And when she said that in 1972 or 1973 or whenever that was, I said, "This woman is," I didn't say she was delusional, but I said, "I don't think that's going to happen." Because at that point in American history, understand the way historians look at these things. At that point in American history, no community had ever gone from being black to being something else. Okay? That, communities had this secession process, and by the time blacks got there, nobody else would come in. Nobody else would be there. So gentrification, except maybe in a few rare instances across the country, gentrification was an unknown concept. And she was explaining the coming gentrification, and I was completely dismissive of it. I didn't believe it would happen because it had not happened on a national level to that point. And now, of course, you can see what's happening in Seattle. I don't have the precise percentages in front of me, but the Central District went from being an overwhelmingly black community. Although, let me be clear, it was never an all-black community.
Yeah.
It was never an all-black community, but from being an overwhelmingly black community to now being a community where blacks are 10, 12% of the population.
Yeah.
That's a huge change in a relatively short time, and it's a change that, as I said, I could not have anticipated in the early 1970s. That just was not on the radar.
This might be a dumb question, and probably kind of a dumb question, but going back to your earliest time there in the Central District, and then over those 20 years, before your book comes out, are there clear examples of systemic racism that everyone just understands or there or just accept, or for the most part accept as just a fact of life in Seattle in the Central District in the 70s?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's hard to wrap my mind around the idea of accept. I think they understood that it was there, and maybe accept is the right word because they understood they couldn't do very much about it. One that comes to mind that comes right down to the day, police brutality. And understand that police brutality is an issue that's been in the black community even longer than going back to the 1960s. If you go to BlackPast and look up the Barry Lawson case, you will see an example of three white policemen, who were convicted of killing a black waiter in 1938. Now, what's unusual about this is it's 1938, but what's even more unusual about it is that a much smaller black community, a community of no more than 3,500 people, 3,000 to 3,500 people, mobilized and, with allies. They couldn't have done it alone, but with allies, they were able to bring these three white policemen to justice. You know what that, you know how remarkable that is? Because it's hard to bring cops to justice today. And they were able to do this in 1938 in Seattle. And so the issue of police brutality is hardly a new one. It's hardly something that was discovered by Black Lives Matter or, by our generation. It's been around for a very, very long time in Seattle and all across the country, not just in Seattle, but all across the country.
In that 1938 case, why were they able? Tell me a little bit about it, and then tell me why that was able to happen.
Well, most of what I know is actually on the website in that entry, but you can do research and find out more.
Okay.
But from what I gather, these policemen, well, first of all, understand that the working class black community tended to live in what we now call the International District. Again, we think of the International District as always having been Asian, but actually it always had Asian groups, but it also had a significant black minority. And the blacks were essentially there because they worked on the railroads or they worked on the ships, and so they were close to the water, they were close to the railroad station. And there was one black waiter. I don't know. He probably worked on one of the ships, one of the steamship lines, who was in a hotel, and this is a working class hotel. Let's be clear. It was almost like a rooming house. And somehow or another, he had a confrontation, and there was an altercation between him and these policemen. And let's put it like this: the policemen say he fell down the stairs. Witnesses say he was pushed down the stairs, and he was killed. And it was going to be initially it was going to be just written off as an accident, and that was the end of it. But the head of the Urban League, and I'm blanking on his name right now. This is what happens when you talk to 71-year-olds in an interview. But you can get all of this information on BlackPast. That's why we have BlackPast, because people get old and they forget. Okay, but you can go to BlackPast and you can find out. I think his name was James Jackson.
Okay.
He was head of the Urban League at the time. He was the first head of the Urban League, first black head of the Urban League, because the Urban League started in 1930. And he did something very un-Urban League-like. The Urban League is usually the organization that tries to find jobs for blacks and tries to help blacks, acclimate to the new urban environment. But in this instance, he decided to lead a coalition to find justice for Barry Lawson. And so he was able to locate a white witness and bring him back from Portland, and to have that person testify. And as a result, these three cops were convicted. Now, their sentences were eventually, if I recall, they were eventually commuted by the governor, or they were pardoned by the governor. And so they didn't spend a lot of time in jail. But the very fact that they were arrested is remarkable, as I said, given the fact that, if you look at all of the people who've been killed by police recently under unusual circumstances, if I can say that very few of those people have been brought to justice in 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020.
Okay. And in the time since your book was published, which is now going on, I guess, a little more than 25 years now.
Yeah, 25
That's crazy.
years.
The 90s already that long ago. What else has changed in addition to the gentrification and what's different about the Central District now than it was 50 years ago or 25 years ago?
Yeah, well, I think gentrification is probably the 800-pound elephant in the room. I mean, if we're talking about a black community and with black institutions nearby or present, and all of a sudden the black population leaves, then that community is put under tremendous pressure. For instance, there have been debates going on for a while in the African American community about whether to locate the main churches, First AME and Mount Zion, to relocate those churches to the suburbs. Yeah. Because essentially what has happened is that the black community has moved to the suburbs. And in fact, the New Beginnings Christian Fellowship is the largest black church, although they would argue that they're not a black church because they have members who aren't black. But they are the largest church with a significant black membership in the entire area. And they're in Renton.
Huh.
They're almost at the Renton-Auburn border.
Interesting.
So in a sense, what has happened is that there has arisen this kind of debate, and so it comes out of the larger question of gentrification, but this debate about whether or not the institutions can survive in an area where they are no longer, there's no longer a significant black population to support them. These were churches, these were landmark churches that had a constituency around them. People walked to church because people lived in the Central District. Well, obviously, if you live in Renton or some of these other places, you can't do it. Let me give you a statistic or a factoid. 2003. In 2003, we reached a tipping point in terms of the African American community. For the first time in the history of this region, this urban region, Seattle and its suburbs, there were more black people who lived in the suburbs than lived in the city of Seattle. Huh. I'm not just talking about the Central District. I'm talking about the entire city of Seattle. And so there's this, gentrification. We talk about gentrification mainly as, the concept, the how would we say this? The influx of whites into the community. The flip side of that coin, and for various reasons, which probably take much longer than we have time for, but the flip side of that coin is that African Americans then began to spread out. The population begins to spread over the entire metropolitan region. I mean, there are black folks in communities today. And remember, I came to Washington in 1971, and I marvel at the fact that there are black folks in these communities, small suburban communities, all over the region. Yeah, there are black folks in Mercer Island. There are black folks in the suburbs of Snohomish County. Look at the huge black influx into places like Auburn and Kent, and certainly Federal Way. I mean, this is amazing. And so when we talk about the black community, we no longer talk about a spatially defined area. We can no longer talk about, a ghetto or a close-knit, physically closed-knit community. We have to talk about a community, and this is one of the arguments that I made a long time ago. We have to talk about the community as a kind of an intellectual construct instead of a physical construct.
Yeah.
In other words, the community is connected by a shared history, shared values, shared issues, but the community itself is spread all over the metropolitan area. And one of the best examples, well, two examples of this now. One is the Jewish community, and that's probably the first to experience this. And the other example is the Asian community, the Asian American community. Most Asian Americans do not live in the international district. Let's be clear. They do not live in the international district and haven't for a long time. And by the same token, obviously, the original Jewish populations were essentially located in the central district, and they're not there anymore.
Yeah, and the central district obviously is created in a time of segregation and redlining, and it's it has its origins in these oppressive policies and attitudes. And given that the population is now as distributed as you described, what good things have been lost by losing that admittedly, legally enforced, oppressive, segregated community? What do you lose by the kind of diaspora creation that you're talking about now?
Yeah, again, you ask very good questions. I don't think there are easy answers. One of the ideas that I've toyed with, and you may be one of the first people I've shared this with. There's a paradox of a black community that is the result of segregation. We all will accept that it's wrong to say that black people can only live in one area of the city. I don't think anybody would embrace the idea that black folks shouldn't be allowed to or shouldn't be able to live in any area of the city. But when black folks become dispersed like this, number one, they lose their traditional political power base. Okay?
Yeah.
They lose their traditional political power base. And to some extent, one could argue that the culture declines. If the culture is based upon, social activities around clubs and around music and around institutions that support those kinds of social activities, and there's no longer a concentration of black people in that area, then those clubs disappear as well. Then those social connectors disappear as well. Now, maybe they can be recreated elsewhere, and I think that certainly there are attempts to do that. But, at one time, Jackson Street, and this is long before the 1960s, because it was declining in the 1960s. At one time, Jackson Street had this concentration of nightclubs. Now, not all of them were owned by black folks. Many of them were owned by Asians. But these were nightclubs that had some of the best jazz performers playing there on a regular basis in the country.
Yeah.
Not just in Seattle, but in the country. And these were both local performers who played there and performers from across the country who played there. And the local performers were on a jazz circuit that extended all the way to China and Japan and the Philippines and the like. I mean, we talk about the Chitlin circuit on the East Coast that ran from, Miami or from Florida up to New York. Imagine a Chitlin circuit that extends all the way across to East Asia.
Wow. Yeah.
And so that, when you have that kind of concentration, I know this may sound like I'm going a different direction,
No.
but the essence of that community and that kind of jazz scene was in a centralized area.
Yeah.
And what if you lose that centralized area? What if you lose that ability of all those folks to come together? Now, we can argue. Some can argue that they will come together in their basements elsewhere, or they will come together, But I think the fact, and I'll try to give you an example. And this is an example that has nothing to do with black folks. But look at Austin, Texas, and look at all the clubs in a particular street. And I can't remember the street now, but I think 3rd or 4th Avenue. You go out of one club into another, or on Beale Street. That's an even better example.
Yeah.
There are all these clubs that are next to each other, have been next to each other for decades and decades, and they literally help to nurse and produce all these remarkable artists. Well, what happens when that goes away? And so I think that's one of the things you lose. I mean, would I be an advocate for resegregation? Of course not.
Yeah.
But I think, whenever you lose, whenever there's a change in demography, particularly of the size and significance of the gentrification that is taking place in the Central District, then there are things that you will lose. There's something that you're going to lose. The question is, can you reproduce it? Can you recreate it in some other form or fashion elsewhere? And that's what the people are doing with the churches. That's what they're doing with, with community art. They're trying to say, can we have these kinds of community markers, community cultural markers, without a spatial community?
And I think about the International District survives as a destination with a bunch of restaurants, different kinds of Asian restaurants and everything. And that's that nobody really questions that, or nobody thinks about that being some kind of segregated neighborhood. Though it's similar sort of arrangement, right?
Yeah, it's a major tourist attraction.
Yeah.
Or you think about, you think about the jazz clubs in New Orleans.
Yeah.
That's a major revenue generator for the city.
Yeah, if I could time travel, I'd visit Jackson Street in the 30s and 40s. That would be one of my first stops. Okay. I'll have one last question for you, and I'll let you go. And I'd love to do this again sometime, because this topic, it's not just some single freestanding topic, this notion of race in Seattle, and especially the black community, because I will probably have questions in the future, and I hope I can reach out to you.
Okay.
Why is it there's only just a handful of books? Like there's your book, there's Esther Mumford's fabulous Black Victorians book from 1980. She did a couple other smaller publications. But I mean, there's, it's one handful of books.
You're asking the wrong person. I mean, I think you have to ask the general writing community, the general historical community. One of the things about historians, and I've thought about this, it has nothing to do directly with your question, but I think it's apropos to your question. One of the things about our profession is that no one assigns us a topic, except when you're writing a dissertation, but no one assigns you a topic after you become an assistant professor. You have complete freedom to come up with whatever topic you want. And quite frankly, very few people have decided to study this. I won't say no one has decided, but very few people have decided to study. And the few people who have studied it, the dissertations don't turn into books. Now, I don't know why. I mean, there are hosts of reasons that, well, all we do is end up speculating here as to why they don't turn into books. But yeah, I mean, as long as there's freedom, as long as academics have the freedom to write on anything they really want to, they can determine what they will write on. One of the big challenges, and let me sort of rephrase it this way. One of the big challenges of African American history in the West is that there are still too many people who don't believe it exists. In other words, African American history is made somewhere else. It's made in the South. It's made in the Midwest. It's made in the East, in the big cities of the East. And, with the exception of Los Angeles and maybe Oakland and San Francisco, African American history to too many people just doesn't exist here. I remember when I first began to research the West, a colleague of mine, who shall remain nameless, and it wasn't a colleague at the University of Washington, but a colleague said, "Oh, I just love stories of black cowboys, as if that was the only thing, the only topic that we could write on in terms of the American West. I have a second book, as you know, on In Search of the Racial Frontier.
Yeah.
And it focuses on African American history in the West from the 1500s up until 1990.
Yeah.
And obviously, that's far beyond the cowboys, although by the 20th century, it's increasingly an urban history. Yeah, I don't know. I really can't answer that question as to why there haven't been more books. I think you just have to, plumb the interests of, graduate programs and the students that are turning out and the individual graduate students. I'll give her a plug here. The new executive director of BlackPast is Dr. Quinita Cobbins Modica. And she's an amazing scholar, and I say that not just because she was my last graduate student, but because she is in her own right. And one of the books that she's writing right now, or the book that she's writing right now, which comes out of her dissertation, is a study of African American women in Seattle in the World War II period from World War II right up until the beginning of the 20th century. No one has written a book on African American women like that, not just in Seattle, but anywhere in the country. So it's a question of what people choose to write on, and in some ways, I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, but in some ways, there's a kind of fad element involved. And what I mean by fad, F-A-D, fad element, is that essentially when a topic gets hot, historians are attracted to it and they write about it.
Yeah.
If the topic is not perceived of as hot, they're not going to write about it. And the hotter the topic, the hotter the perception of the topic, the perception that the topic is hot, the more people are going to gravitate toward that idea. And so what we've tried to do is, with our own writing, to make African American history in Seattle and in the West attractive. We tried to say that there's a history out here that you can and you should investigate. But it's ultimately up to others, not me, not Dr. Cobbins Modica or a few other people to make that happen. We can only write, and we can hope that others will be interested. Maybe people who are experiencing this interview who will step forward and say, "This is something I want to do."
Yeah, because you look at the old, like, you read Bagley, you read Meany, any of the sort of the old white guys of Seattle history, and there's nary a mention that I can tell. Occasionally they'll say, like, they'll mention like a Negro something, it'll be some sort of very side note, but there's no recognition of any actual, quantifiable community of black people here in any of those, as far as I can, in my reading.
Right, and I will say there are two factors. Number one, because the black population was very small. Let's be clear on that.
Yeah.
But number two, because they were writing different types of histories. They were writing histories that tended to look at the elites. Because let's face it, there wasn't a lot on the working class. There wasn't a lot on women. There wasn't a lot on poor people in general.
Yeah, it's true.
And black people simply weren't in those elite categories.
Yeah, it's true. Well, listen, I really appreciate your time. I always appreciate a great conversation, and I appreciate you answering the questions as thoughtfully as you did. This is great. Thanks again for speaking with us, and people can find out more about you and more about your work at blackpast.org. That's correct?
Yes.
Terrific.
And
okay.
I urge people to come to the website. We have over 6,000 pages of information, and essentially we cover not just Pacific Northwest African American history, we literally cover the globe.
Right on. Dr. Quintard Taylor, thanks for joining us on Columbia Conversations.
Okay, thank you for having me.
Thank you to Dr. Quintard Taylor for speaking with me on this episode of Columbia Conversations from the Washington State Historical Society. For more information about Dr. Taylor's work, please visit blackpast.org. For more information about Columbia Magazine or to subscribe, please visit washingtonhistory.org. I'm Feliks Banel.